Okay, it's 5 minutes past the hour. Good day, America, and all of our ships at sea. Welcome to the Madison Grand Strategy Project First Wednesday Sea Power Workshop. Today's February 4th, 2026. I'm your host, Paul Giera. Today's guests are Captain Bryan Lees, U.S. Navy retired, and Captain Jim Fanell, U.S. Navy retired. Bryan and Jim are both U.S. Navy intelligence officers, and today's topic is U.S. Navy operational intelligence. Bryan will discuss his first book, he's working on a second, At Sea Against the Soviet Fleet, The Evolution of U.S. Navy Operational Intelligence in the Cold War. Jim Fanell will offer remarks from his long perspective on operational intelligence. Dave Rosenberg has answered the question about whether he's going to make it back from the National Archives in time, and we'll hear from him for a few minutes as well. And just to remind, Dave Rosenberg was the end of Cold War director of the OpIntel Lessons Learned project, which led to the great history, the Admiral's Advantage, U.S. Navy operational intelligence in World War II and the Cold War. And just for the record, Dave's co-author, Chris Ford, has also joined us today, and we'll ask for their thoughts on this important topic in a moment. Before I introduce Bryan and then Jim, there's something on my mind that I want to share very briefly. Dr. Nick Lambert's purposeful rendering of sea power in his recent Naval Institute Author of the Year book, The Neptune Factor, captures Alfred Thayer Mahan's bloody-minded clarity about the Navy's role in American political economy. Sea power is, quote, commercial before it is military. It exerts strategic leverage by controlling access to the global trading system, the arteries of the world economy. Those states well supplied with the blood of trade prosper. Those cut off from it atrophy. Mahan was quite explicit that the destruction or disruption of an enemy's commerce could force capitulation without decisive fleet engagements. It's therefore rather disconcerting that neither the Trump administration nor the Navy has fully articulated this Mahanian basis of their shared interests. The president supports naval expansion without explaining how a larger fleet underwrites innovation, manufacturing, and economic vitality by stabilizing global commerce. Naval leaders welcome political support for shipbuilding, but remain largely silent on how naval power advances the administration's economic agenda. Yet the logic is clear. The fleet enables continued commerce with allies while constraining adversaries' access to global markets during crisis or war. The Navy's ability to regulate the movement of resources worldwide gives the United States a form of leverage not yet matched by other great powers, and one that can be exercised short of war to signal resolve and preview the consequences of aggression. These capabilities underpin democracy, reinforce the Army and the Air Force, and give credibility to American commitments, which remain the foundation of deterrence and security. In peacetime, the Navy ensures that global trade remains safe and predictable. In crisis or war, it offers a dominant instrument of great power competition, the ability to isolate an adversary from the global political economy. Mahan understood that presidents would eventually recognize commerce as the foundation of American power. President Trump appears to share that intuition. The Navy's task now is to articulate clearly and strategically how it protects that economy in peace, strengthens deterrence, and generates decisive leverage in war. Not independent of other instruments of power, but central and indispensable to them all. Now let's clear the decks and turn to the main event. Captain Bryan Lees, U.S. Navy retired, will speak to us today about his first book, At Sea Against the Soviet Fleet, The Evolution of U.S. Navy Operational Intelligence of the Cold War. I was introduced to Bryan years ago by Jim Fanell, who's with us today. That introduction eventually led to this important sea power workshop. I was able to attend Bryan's first book talk last year and immediately knew that he should address this group. Bryan graduated from Kutztown University of Pennsylvania in 1993 and then enlisted as an intelligence specialist, Navy, in October 95 and was later commissioned an ensign in 1997 through the Aviation Officer Candidate School in Pensacola as a naval intelligence officer. I don't want to go too far with this comparison, but Richard Gere in An Officer and a Gentleman comes to mind. Bryan holds a master's degree from Texas Christian University in liberal arts and from the U.S. Army War College in strategic studies and a PhD in war studies from King's College London. Bryan's book evolved from his PhD dissertation. He's currently an associate professor for the National Defense University at the Joint Forces Staff College. He's there because he wants to teach and has dedicated his second career to that calling. Bryan's operational tours reflect success in U.S. Navy intelligence, ranging from being a division officer in USS Abraham Lincoln to an intel officer for P3 Special Projects at VPU-1 to director of intel for Commander Amphibious Squadron 2 and then Assistant Chief of Staff for Intel for Carrier Strike Group 2 and George H.W. Bush. Bryan's shore tours include counterterrorism intelligence analyst for U.S. Naval Forces Europe, instructor and director of intermediate training for Naval and Marine Corps Intelligence Training Center, and Joint Intel Ops Center in Molesworth, UK, and instructor in the Department of Military Strategy and Planning Operations Department at the U.S. Army War College in Carlisle. Bryan served as the Navy's Senior Service Advisor and Chair of the Defense Intelligence Department, National Intelligence University, and as military faculty and the Senior Intelligence Officer at the U.S. Naval War College. It's appropriate to mention Bryan's qualifications and endorsements by award. He's a fully qualified Joint Service Officer and has a chest full of impressive personal decorations, 14 of them as I count. You will not be surprised that Bryan was the 2003 Atlantic Fleet Junior Intelligence Officer of the Year in 2013, the recipient of the Edward T. Layton Leadership and Mentoring Award, and received the National Intelligence Certificate of Distinction in 2013. He's married to Miss Elizabeth Olives of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, has 2 daughters and 1 grandson. Bryan, over to you.
Thanks, Paul, for that long-winded description of my career. It's been a great career. And like you said, I continue to teach and I really enjoy that. Maybe most of all, but not as much as I enjoyed being at sea. I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to everyone this afternoon or tonight, depends on how you look at it. You know, the book did come from my dissertation at King's College, and that was a 5-year project for me. And there are several people in the audience tonight that I did interview for the book. Peter Schwartz was a key person to give me some ideas and point me in the right direction early on, as well as David Rosenberg. And then, we're going to talk about David Rosenberg and Chris Ford's book, Admiral's Advantage, which was a key piece of literature, probably the key piece of literature that exists when you talk about the U.S. naval intelligence. So I'm going to share my screen here, and I have a few slides. Okay. Before we start, I do have to point out that the views expressed in my book and what I'm going to say today are mine and do not reflect the official policy or position of the Department of the Navy, Department of Defense, or the U.S. government, or the National Defense University. So I'm going to focus on 3 things tonight. Why op-intel mattered in the Cold War, why is it important now, and how this book complements the Admiral's Advantage that David Rosenberg and Chris Ford wrote. My book really was born from my own ignorance of my own vocation. I opened the book with a story about how I watched a 1962 era, so a 60s era Soviet destroyer, the Smet Levy, try to penetrate our screen in 2017 when I was on the George H.W. Bush, and watch the USS Valgolf try to prevent that from happening and doing a poor job at it. So it was very interesting for me to be in 2017 to see that happening and reflect back on Cold War evolutionary type things with regard to the Navy and operational intelligence. And the more I reflected on how we conducted operational intelligence in 2017 and to this day, the less I understood about how we got there. And if I couldn't understand how we got to do it this way, then how was I going to know what things to change to make it better in the future? And so that's really what started the book. Um, and it grew from there into the dissertation, as I said. So, why did op intel matter in the Cold War? For the same reasons it matters today: speed, proximity, and survival. During the jet and missile age that was emerging in the 60s, and my book focuses really on the 1960s and 1970s. It ends somewhere at the beginning of the 80s and into the 80s. But in the epilogue, I do talk about how we've evolved since then. The book focuses on three pieces of critical intelligence systems: the Integrated Operational Intelligence Center, which came along with the RA5C Vigilante, which was a collection platform, high speed, Mach 2 plus aircraft that could take not only great pan imagery, focused imagery, but also SLR, side looking imagery, and also collected signals intelligence at the same time. And then the other thing that I focused on was how we try to operationalize decision-making support through the Navy. And that looked at some pieces of equipment like Eclipse, which helped us display kind of a common intelligence picture. And then also Outlaw Shark, which was a program that helped us link national reconnaissance intelligence to the tactical user at sea. So those are the things that I really focused on. Along the way, I realized that the technology was interesting, but what was fascinating was how Navy intelligence adapted organizationally to meet the needs of its customer, the afloat commander. And that's kind of what the book really focuses on in its final chapter, is this understanding that it evolved the way it did, not from a top-down perspective, but from a coordination without hierarchy, where intelligence officers of the same rank all worked together to support the commander. And so the North Star of everything that was happening and how we evolved really was this servant attitude towards the commander and serving the commander to help them understand the environment, understand the adversary, give them indications and warnings that allowed them to make better decisions faster than the adversary. And so that's part of that whole survival. The proximity is we were at sea with them, kind of elbow to elbow or cheek to jowl, as it's been described, putting that intelligence into the right context for them, and then doing it at a speed that made the decisions relevant, right? Made the decisions an advantage. Part of what technology brought was a decentralization of the intelligence itself. No longer was it just in Washington, D.C., where this kind of intelligence was being done. At the OSIS nodes out in the fleet, so the first one being ROTA, and the Ocean Surveillance Information System, allowed them to do their own analysis with access to that highly classified intelligence, make it relevant to the commander at the time. And no longer did Washington, D.C. hold kind of all of the cards when it came to that type of analysis. The experts became those forward, decentralized OSIS nodes where the analysis was being done in real time and done to support the fleet. It starts out, and I talk a lot about Vietnam in the book, because the Vietnam War, like all wars, brings change about faster. And so when you have this anvil, as I describe it, of the Vietnam War and the Navy's operations, flying sortie after sortie into North Vietnam, hunting trucks, as it was called, for Iron Hand operations, but also trying to bomb and deny the enemy the logistics support it needed to continue to fight. That anvil becomes the thing that hammers out this new intelligence center that has been created through the RA5C Vigilante program. So that Integrated Operational Intelligence Center, or IOIC, it becomes very successful because its process is hammered out, sortie after sortie, rep after rep, set after set during the Vietnam War. And the intelligence organization that supports it adapts and continues to learn and evolve as the conditions change during that war. But that war also brought about a blockade effort, right? We had a close blockade when you looked at market time, and then game warden was a close blockade inside the delta of the Mekong Delta. And then Sea Lords was more of a close blockade up into the riverine areas north of Saigon. And so all of that experience of how to patrol and then man and control water space forced intelligence officers to not only become liaisons to ground operations, right? So now they're elbow to elbow with the operator on the ground. And that teaches them a whole new level of performance orientation that they bring back and share with the rest of the community. New ways to do things, new ways to collect, new support mechanisms for decision makers as well. But also at sea, where you have maritime patrol aircraft scouting, relaying contacts, passing contacts on to surface units that can do interdiction of those things. And so that's a different type of intelligence. That is an intelligence that's not just targeting, but also trying to create a common operating picture that we can get an advantage from. And so even the targeting aspect that's going on in the IOIC afloat is benefiting from all the things that they're learning elsewhere as people rotate in and out and as ships come off the line and go back into the line. So that becomes very important to this. The integrated air defense system that the Soviets had sold to the Vietnamese becomes the thing that a lot of intel is focused on defeating. And so that really hones our understanding of how to do suppression of that type of IAD system, as well as how to take advantage of it, both directly and indirectly, so that you can achieve the mission that you want. And then I tell a story about Admiral David Richardson. And Admiral David Richardson, to me, is one of the most important parts of the story for the evolution of Navy op intel during the 60s and 70s. He was a man that really saw the benefit of float operational intelligence, and he was willing to fight to get more support for it. As Task Force 77 commander, he decides that there is no way that they can fly more sorties and be more effective. So they have to be bombing things that matter. And so he starts to approach this from a systems of systems approach. Now, that term isn't used until much later when Admiral Owens kind of coins it. But as you read David Richardson's oral history, you see that coming out. And he is marrying up his operators with the intelligence personnel to figure out what is the best thing to attack. Not just a bridge because it looks important, but a bridge that may look unassuming, but actually is a key to the node, the logistics node, and taking that bridge out, that pontoon bridge, that whatever bridge might be more important and less loss come from it from us, right? Less damage to our own attack force, but achieve a greater thing. And so that really becomes the idea of a force multiplier where, there's one example in the book where they do find that one floating bridge, they destroy that, it backs up all the train traffic. And while they wait for the trucks to show up to offload the trains, they then have a killing ground that they can just destroy over 100 vehicles and rolling stock, and very successful mission. So again, he was able to show that. He then's going to parlay that understanding into his Sixth Fleet Command. That happens in 1968, and that's when he starts to demand that he get better intelligence, and that ultimately results in the OSIS coming to life, and the first OSIS center being in Rota to support him. The Sixth Fleet Commander, because he demanded it to happen. He also helps again, with the decentralization of intelligence by getting them to change the rules about the tactical use of national intelligence things. And then, ultimately, the competition at sea becomes important too. Past war, the Vietnam War, as the Soviet Navy rises in size and in capability, the U.S. Navy has to go and look at ways to be present and create the capability to have sea control when they need it. And that means they need to be able to track things. They also are very important that they can track the submarines, especially the SSBNs that offer a second strike capability, which was key to the Soviets' plan. And then part of that that decision making at sea that comes from the post Vietnam era is this idea that Admiral Brooks talked to me about, which was he called it the two squares of linoleum, and that the commander should be able to plant 1 foot in each square of blue tile linoleum in his flag bridge and see a display that showed him where both red and blue were in context, as well as any white shipping, so that he could make decisions and communicate those decisions directly to his ships at sea and his aircraft and make those decisions faster than the enemy could. And that concept led to outlaw shark or outlaw hawk type demonstrations where we're trying to link national intelligence to the tactical user. Eclipse was a way to machine read Link 14 message traffic and display it and kind of keep a database of where these things were so that it wasn't just a metal, a magnet on a metal piece of board map. It was now something that had more data associated with it and was alive, so to speak. And really some of that outlaw shark system and the way that that worked, we see today in our geek systems, right? It was an evolution from that point. And if you look at Iron Horse, which was a system the Air Force with NSA support had created in late 68, you see elements of outlaw shark there, and therefore you see elements of it in today's global command and control systems as well. Unfortunately, that system was destroyed when the ammo dump blew up at Da Nang and kind of lost to history. But there are quite a few reports about it, and that's where I found it. So that kind of is why it mattered at the time. So why is it important now? Well, the model endures, right? As I tell the students at the Naval Intelligence Basic course, when I go out to talk to them, the things you're going to be doing in civic at sea now are the same things that were done, same types of things that were done in the 60s when the IOIC came about. The IOIC was so successful, again, that hammer and anvil, hammering out such a good system, that there has not been a large deck ship built by the US Navy that does not include an intelligence center, and one that is modeled after the IOIC from the early 1960s, because the model endures. Now, the way we do business, right, the network-centric ways that things happen, and how we sense and do sense making have all changed and advanced with technology. But Boyd's OODA loop, right, observe, orient, decide, and act still matters. And having a timely, trusted, tailored intelligence product delivered to somebody you trust, that intelligence officer, that's yours, right, that you have choke con over, as I describe it in the book, because you can squeeze him to get the stuff that you need from them. And he is going to reach back to his compadres that are ashore and get that information so that he can give it and tailor it to his boss. That system remains, right? The interaction without hierarchy, that coordination that occurs, is what makes OpIntel afloat work to this day. And so that is something that came out of the Vietnam era, came out of all this, but it also comes out of culture. And I talk a lot about how the aviation culture really shaped how naval intelligence culture grew as well. And it's not just because the aviators were, 90% of our business at the beginning when we merged the 1350s, which was the URL air intelligence officers into the 1630 group, which were intelligence specialists. That's some of it, but most of it comes from the fact that that culture, that aviation culture, allowed for experimentation. It embraced a learning organization that was willing to try new things and have loose have loose coupling of organizations to get better things out of it. And that is what we see generating the evolution of Navy op intel. And so that really matters. So again, the model endures. My time on the Bush and watching Smet Levy, and there were a couple kilos that were out at the time too. That again brought home to me how important our decentralized intelligence was, and how important it was that I was able to use the network of things on the ships that were in the strike group to make sense of what we were seeing and to understand things better. And I reflected on the fact that during an exercise, we were training the Queen Elizabeth Strike Group and their staff. Their carrier had not yet been commissioned. And their Commodore was on board, and he spent an hour and a half in my intelligence spaces watching us conduct this exercise. And at the end, he said, that's really interesting, but why do you do it this way? Why not just have it done ashore and just beamed to you and just displayed? Why are you guys doing the fusion here and doing some analysis here? Why can't it just be done ashore? And I spent a lot of time explaining how we do it to him, not why we do it that way. And I think the why we do it that way really goes back to speed, proximity, and survival, and that those things make a difference. And being there with the operator means you have better context in what you're providing them. And so again, what is old is new. The model still endures, and that is really important. And I think something that I think if somebody were to look at this again in 20 years, they would see that the model does still endure. As I talked about, the institutionalization of afloat intelligence in the fleet is also something that we should consider. It is changing today, and they're trying to find ways to reform intelligence afloat to make it better. I think the creation of the information warfare community, which is what my next book is about, is how did we get to the decision to make the information dominance corps in 2009? What was the thinking that led to that? Because that is really missing from our history. We have a few record messages and we have a few slides here and there that explain the things that were happening, but not the thinking behind those things. And that's kind of what I'm exploring now. And so in the end of this book, I do talk about the creation of the information warfare community. And I do kibitz a little bit that it was done without the traditional concept process where somebody puts forward a white paper that offers a concept for transformation or some new technology application. And then we debate that a little bit, and then it becomes doctrine, and then we execute the doctrine. The intelligence community made decisions and executed without ever really having that part. And it worked out just as it had worked out in the past, but that's really not a model that you can trust over and over again. So that is one of the things I kibitz about in that. Then and I think today when you look at Operation Southern Spear and our maritime security and interdiction things that are happening in the Caribbean and in the Western Atlantic down there, you see it rhymes with Vietnam War, the littorals, market time, game warden, all the things that we did, the raids, the naval blockading that happened during the Vietnam War, commerce raiding. And you can also draw these same linkages to when I first came in the Navy, we were doing a lot of maritime interdiction ops in the Arabian Sea. And later on, we have piracy that we're dealing with. So again, the model endures, and what's old is new in some cases. And I try to bring that out in the book a little bit. So the picture on the screen is the poster from the Outlaw Shark fusion room that was in Naples. And so I find that, is a great Navy photo there, great Navy poster. And to me, what the Admiral's Advantage did when it came out, and I remember them handing out copies to all of the officers. So I think it was 2005, it came out in print, and I remember being given a copy. Now, I was in the mid-career course at Nimitz when I was given the copy. And thinking back on it, maybe I was given it to read, but it went home with me because it was such a valuable book. Not only did it give me an understanding of things I didn't know about how we got to where we were, but I thought it filled a great gap after Packard's Century of Naval Intelligence. Packard's Century of Naval Intelligence I've described as really a reference book. The way it's organized makes it somewhat challenging. It's not necessarily chronological, but it's got a lot of great things in it, and the sources were great. It took Packard, I think, 25 or 30 years working at the Naval Archive. I think he had a desk there. I remember Curtis Utz showing me the desk and saying that's where Packard wrote the book. But it came out classified in the beginning, and it was later declassified. Packard's book, as well as the Admiral's Advantage, were sponsored by the Directors of Naval Intelligence, right? So it was a way for naval intelligence to tell its story. From a cultural perspective, that's an artifact that you need, right? Your uniform, your what we now call the nerd nickel, the intel pin that we have, those are all artifacts of our culture and our identity. And Packard's book starts that artifact in literature, and Rosenberg and Ford really take it to a new level with the Admiral's Advantage, and it really lays out things. But the Admiral's Advantage, a lot of that comes out of the 1998 OpIntel Lessons Learned Conference that was held at Nimitz. I was actually a student at that time, coming back through a school there. And so there was a lot of, our legacy and the people I would call heroes that were wandering the halls because they were there for that conference. The lowly JG was not allowed into the room for that. But it was nice to see that those things were happening, and the Admiral's Advantage does capture a lot from those interviews that were conducted during that, I think, 3 or 4 day conference that thing. The Admiral's Advantage really looks, I think, at a more strategic level at naval intelligence and its role in, clearly the deterrence, the third leg of the deterrence, nuclear deterrence triad, but also looking at how things evolved with naval intelligence at a higher level. Whereas I tried to focus more on the operational level and tactical level at sea and the things that mattered there. And so that's the scope and level thing, right? My scope was really focused around a couple pieces of technology that mattered at sea, and focused around experience of those officers and sailors that were there at the time and that could recall and tell me stories about those things. And so that's, I think, where my book complements the Admiral's Advantages. It gives a little more detail. It adds more to the body of knowledge than was there before. And again, it highlights the organizational learning of naval intelligence, that coordination without hierarchy. That's so critical, but something you can't design for. It really is a thing that occurs through adaptation, as long as there are not too many restraints that do not allow adaptation. And so that doesn't mean there's not centralization at some point. If you decentralize and you adapt through that decentralizing mechanism, at some point you have to sweep it all up and try to re-centralize these things and take on board the lessons learned that came out of the adaptation and formalize it, especially because you can't fund it if you don't. And so that was one of the things I learned in the book, was when we did try to get our arms around the decentralization and this coordination without hierarchy, it really was a benefit because it allowed us to fund things, because now we could we could say what it was. But then almost immediately, decentralization and adaptation starts again, right? And the coordination without hierarchy results. Because as I've said, and this is said about many things, if you've seen one intel organization on one strike group, then you've seen one intel organization on one strike group. They all adapt differently to the leadership that they're supporting, to that leader's culture, that leader's perspective and proclivities, right? And what they like and what they don't like. And so everybody adapts to that, and everybody changes as needed. So there's a picture from the Admiral's Advantage that shows the FOSIF watch floor in the 70s. It's one of the only pictures I could find that gave a sense of what had been described to me by people like Nels Litzinger and many others, J.R. Redding, who had been on these watch floors. I thought it was a much grander thing until I found that picture in the Admiral's Advantage, and one I had looked at many times before. And it did reflect what I remember of the watch floor at London. So very interesting there. And I'll stop there and open it up for any questions, or for, I think Chemo has something to say. I'm going to stop sharing.
Great. Thank you so much. That was really great, Bryan. What ideas, what a book. Now let's hear from Jim Fanell, the indefatigable Jim Fanell. He's been telling it like it is for a very long time. You always know where you stand with Jim, and I mean that as a compliment. He's an old friend and colleague, and it was Jim who introduced me to the idea of naval operational intelligence in the first place. When Jim retired from the Navy, another good friend observed at Jim's retirement ceremony that the Chinese are greatly encouraged by the end of Jim's service in uniform. It was quite a ride in his near 30-year career in naval intelligence, and he specialized in the Indo-Pacific. His most recent assignment, his last assignment, was as Director of Intelligence and Information Operations for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. In that job and today, he went out of his way to highlight the growing threat from the PLA Navy and continues to do so. He served in an unprecedented series of assignments that focused on the U.S. On the PLA Navy in the Pacific and in China. And in addition to that, he was a National Security Affairs Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, and is currently as a government fellow with the Geneva Center for Security Policy in Switzerland. Jim is a founding member of the Committee on Present Danger China. He's a ubiquitous and tireless national and international public speaker, most notably at AFCEA West of the U.S. Naval Institute China panels, and the China Economic and Security Review Commission before the U.S. House of Representatives Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and so on. He's been featured in numerous, almost innumerable outlets, and has an extensive list of public works. He's written a book, co-authored, Embracing Communist China, America's Greatest Strategic Failure. So you can tell that there's sort of a common thread that works through everything Jim has done and said. And if you don't know, he is also the creator and manager of the Indo-Pacific Security Forum called Red Star Rising, and now called Red Star Risen since 2005.
Well, thank you, Paul. It's an honor to be in this forum. And I just want to applaud Bryan and congratulate him on his book. It is really one of the three pillars of unclassified published material about naval intelligence, U.S. naval intelligence. As he mentioned, Captain Packard's The Century of Naval Intelligence, Dave Rosenberg and Chris Ford's The Admiral's Advantage, and now we will all say At Sea Against the Soviet Fleet. I had an honor to read the galley before it was published over a year ago, I think. And then I just, thanks to Paul for mailing me a copy because I couldn't get a copy here in Switzerland. Paul mailed me a copy, and I've just finished reading it today to kind of refresh me. And it was really, for me, a like a walk down memory lane from my experiences as a squadron intelligence officer, a CAG AI, a carrier strike group N2, a numbered fleet N2, and then a fleet N2. And so my life in the Navy when I was in uniform, and even though I'm living in landlocked continental Europe, my thinking is always about the fleet and the ocean and what makes the Navy unique and special. And I know everybody in this forum has their own experiences in life and shares the same passions in different ways. And so how do we express that? How do we inform our leadership, whatever parties in power, the Pentagon? How do we get our nation to restore America's maritime power is my passion. And so I'm very happy to see Bryan's book because it highlights something that's enduring that was created. I don't know, Paul, if you can pull up the slides while I'm talking here. But operational intelligence is something that I think is, as Bryan's book points out, it's the creation of from the fleet. It's from the bottom up. And as we go to the next slide, as Paul gets these going, this is the thing that drove me, but also I think drove the whole community for the last 85 years. This is from Captain Joe Rochefort. This is the mission statement for all of naval intelligence, which is to say we have one job, one mission, and that's to tell our commander, our superior today, what the enemy is going to do tomorrow. And if that's your job, and if you don't do it, then you failed. And so that's the way Joe Rochefort approached life. You all should know who Joe Rochefort is, but I'll just remind you, he was the commander of Station Hypo, the officer in charge of the combat intelligence unit there in Pearl Harbor before 7 December 1941 and through the Battle of Midway. And the next slide shows the Max Showers, Admiral Max Showers, which some here will know. I had the privilege of knowing Admiral Showers for the last 15 years of his life. He was a fresh caught Lieutenant JG that arrived in Pearl Harbor January, February 1942. And he served with Admiral Nimitz and worked for Joe Rochefort and was out there in the Pacific Fleet headquarters through the end of the war. So he was there 4.5 years, and then he came back 20 years later and became the N2 for the Pacific Fleet. And so what he told me, if you go to the next slide, is he just said, everything was born out of this experience of what happened at Pearl Harbor on 7 December. And so we know what it looked like before the strike. And then if you go to the next slide, this is the enduring vision that he had. And frankly, I have spent 14 years of my 29 years in Hawaii, at Oahu, at PAC Fleet, and IPAC, and JICPAC, and FOSIC PAC. And I saw the Arizona every day of my life, just about. I lived just around there. And so it was never lost on me the impact of what happens when you don't have operational intelligence. And so this concept of never being surprised, providing strategic, operational, and tactical warning wherever you are in that chain of command, that is the driving agenda for what we do. And what I liked about Bryan's book is it showed how that mindset got transferred in a way to the fleet, to the ships that we have in the fleet. And if you go to the next slide, in Bryan's book, he talks a lot, he references, I think, Nels Litzinger a few times. And where Nell says, well, we didn't have any textbooks, we didn't have any instructions. And that's exactly what Admiral Showers used to say to me when he was there in Pearl Harbor working at Station Hypo after December 7th, 1941. He said, we didn't have anything to tell us how to do this. We had to figure it out on our own. And so part of my hope, part of my aspiration is that we are always innovating. We're always creating from necessity. We're pragmatists. And I think that mindset is still very, very important for us today as we look to the future, in the future that I see, which is going to be dominated by the People's Republic of China and their Navy. We just had Operation Absolute Resolve, where we sent the USS Ford sitting off Venezuela for couple of months before we did the operation. It was essentially in a benign environment. Today, the USS Abraham Lincoln sitting off on its own, having a problem in terms of worrying about Iranians. Now there's Iranian threat, but it's not killing the Lincoln is there. She's essentially in a benign threat environment. Say there's no threat environment, but it's benign to the extent that compared to what we would expect off of China. So, which is to get to essentially the book that Bryan wrote. It gets to the end of the 80s essentially, and the creation of the information warfare community and the information dominance corps. And where are we today? And so if we go to the next slide, it's kind of an overview of Bryan's book, which is to talk about pre his book when Admiral Showers out of the coming to Pearl Harbor and what happened there and the impact of attack on Pearl Harbor and the Battle of Midway and all that. But Bryan's book really picks up in the 60s and the 70s and talks about the development of OSIS ashore and the op intel mindset in the fleet. And when we get to the 90s, at the end of that, with Goldwater and Nichols and this idea that we're going to eliminate service intelligence centers and create joint intelligence centers, we saw this transition from the OSIS system into the JICs and the JACs and all of that. And what I call the lost decade, if you will, is after the Soviet Union collapsed and we had, the base realignment and closures, and we had this peace dividend, so to speak. At least that's what we were talking about. And you had Francis Fukuyama talking about the end of history and this idea that everybody was going to be, the world would become democratized. And we started essentially gutting the Navy and gutting our op intel mindset. Now, they were still contained in these joint intelligence centers, but this idea that we were having to deal with or worry about a peer competitor Navy just kind of left our mindset. And so what happened is, if you go to the next slide, is really what kind of drove my life the last 15 years of my life, which was this idea of how do we reconstitute an OSIS kind of structure and an afloat intelligence structure that can leverage the assets that we have. We weren't going to get any new CNO OPNAV funding to create an OSIS system. So how can we create with what we had inside the Pacific Fleet to track and follow what the Chinese Navy was doing? And the Russian Navy was still out there in the Pacific, oh, by the way, and so was the North Korean Navy. And so we were starting with my time on CTF-70 on the Kitty Hawk. We established the FDNF, Four Deployed Naval Forces Intelligence Federation, and we started linking together our assets inside that strike group to do operational intelligence. And I had come from the Pacific Fleet, 4 years on that staff, where we were focused on China at a strategic operational level. And I get out to the Westpac, and both 7th Fleet and CTF-70 had been kind of taken away from that mission, and were focused on counterterrorism operations in the Philippines and things of that nature. And so I think drove this was to say there's a Chinese threat that's coming and we have to pay attention to it. And so we developed this federation, and then I was fortunate enough to go to 7th Fleet, work for Admiral Byrd, and he understood this implicitly. And so we expanded what was a carrier strike group concept to the entirety of the 7th Fleet. So we were asking our task forces, CTF-72, CTF-74, CTF-76, to get involved with federating our intelligence and using all of the tools that we had, both intelligence and cryptologic resources, to get a better common operational picture of what the Chinese Navy was doing. And then by the time I got to the Pacific Fleet, that was actually put into an instruction under Admiral Cecil Haney in 2012 called the SINCPAC Fleet Instruction Fleet Intelligence Federation. And so that's a formal instruction that's still in existence. And I'm working with Bryan and a group of other naval intelligence professionals on the second volume, if you will, of Captain Packard's book about the history of naval intelligence. And I'm supposed to be writing this chapter on what I've just kind of outlined to you. And part of that is to talk about where we are from 2014, 2015 to today. And I was pleased to learn that even under this new concept of the Maritime Operations Centers at our fleet commanders and below, that in Pacific Fleet, we have a Maritime Operations Center, but there's also a director today. Captain Will Fox is the director of the Pacific Fleet Intelligence Federation. So the Federation is still in existence as a formal entity. My concern, and Paul and I have talked about this extensively, and Bill Hamblett and I have as well, and talking with people that are currently in the system, is how do we go about continuing to advance this so that we're really taking a holistic approach to the PLA threat, because the PLA Navy is not the Iranian Navy, it's not the North Korean Navy, it's not anything in Venezuela or Southcom or Fourth Fleet's AOR. This is a peer competitor with real significant combat lethality that's going to make achieving our objectives in the Pacific, whether it's defending Taiwan or defending our allies in Japan or in the Republic of the Philippines, extremely difficult. And we can't do a piecemeal approach to dealing with that threat. And so I say that in not a pejorative terms, but my concern is that I don't see the emphasis. I think I would echo what Paul said at the beginning of this VTC, is that we want to make sure that we are doing everything that we can to get to this. And so I think I'll end with the fact that this battleship that the president's proposed is a lot of criticisms and a lot of, we can, that from a platform perspective, we can talk about that. But one of the things that doesn't come up in any of the books that I mentioned, in Bryan's book and the Packard's book or the Admiral's Advantage, to a degree, is this idea that what we learned from Admiral Nimitz, and if you read Craig Simon's Nimitz at War, you'll get this notion that the numbered fleets are an integral part of our Navy, and they were integral in World War II in the war at sea across the Pacific. And so the idea that we're going to create a platform that's a battleship that's not just for fires, but also for command and control is really important, because we have put all our eggs in the basket of the carrier, in the sense that we want the carriers to do carrier operations, but we're still kind of forgetting the lessons from Desert Storm and other episodes where the ability of our carriers to take on flight operations and running that kind of process and commanding a joint force that's going to maintain a joint battle space dominance over an adversary like China is really a challenge. And so I wonder if we need to think more about where our command and control at sea is and how it's integrated with our ashore commands, and where does intel and the op intel processes that Bryan puts so nicely in his book, how do we accentuate those and bring those to the fore? And if we're thinking that we're only going to do it from our carriers, I think we need to rethink that. So I'll leave it there and look forward to your questions.
Very quickly. First, it was Christopher Ford who wrote The Admiral's Advantage. I ran it as a project, helped put together the op intel effort, and then I did editing, and I was the guy who renamed it when the Naval Institute was balking in 2004 to publish it. And Naval Intelligence, thanks to Tony Cothran, stepped in with some subvention, which is how the book got published. Second, the book came as a result of a direction from the late Admiral Ted Schaefer, as Director of Naval Intelligence, after I had finished a highly classified history of the intelligence behind the maritime strategy that some folks on this audience are familiar with. Third, I think Bryan has done a great job. I agree with everything he said, and I agree with everything that Jim said with respect to all of this. And fourth, the big issue that relates to a lot of this, which is what I'm still engaged in, is the problem that we don't know enough of the history to help us. Jim's point about Nimitz is right, but it's also the case that this was going on throughout the Cold War, and there's large amounts of information that we need to work on to get out, because the Navy is the worst of all the services with respect to declassifying and knowing its own history. Bryan's work is really important. I talked to Jack Dorsett years ago about doing a history of the Information Dominance Corps, and I'm delighted that he's undertaking it and that there shouldn't be too many problems because most of that was unclassified in the first place. But many of the things that have gone on, particularly what Jim did with the Intelligence Federation, I benefited from this. Jim and I go back many, many, many years to Pacific Fleet, Joint Task Force 519, 7th Fleet, and also the joys of my last two Terminal Furies, where I had the distinction of being the so-called Fanell control officer, so that Dale Relog didn't kill him during the joys of all of that. As Jim, as many know, can be very, very enthusiastic about a lot of things that he's in charge with. So anyway, with all of that, I will end this and also be able to take any additional questions if anybody has any.
I mean, first of all, Jeff Bezos is going to be really delighted that I was on this thing, because I'm going to go out and get a hold of some copies of Bryan's book. I hope Bryan will be delighted as well. And also the Packard 2.0 book, whenever it surfaces, came out. So Godspeed on that one. Very cool stuff. In terms of just looking back at the Admiral's Advantage, I sort of see there as being three kind of wrapped up together in that one. And one is, of course, the history that we tried to tell of Opintel. But the second narrative is more implied, and that's one that Dave just alluded to as well. And that is, in some sense, it's also a parable about institutional memory and the importance of not forgetting. And as Dave was just saying, what drove the project was Dave's realization of just how desperate desperate a job it was to actually not forget all that was happening. And we had the good fortune to do the project and to meet some of these, as Bryan said earlier, some of these heroes of our Opintel history at a time when, even at that point, 20 years ago, they were rapidly passing from the scene. So there's a kind of a sub story about not forgetting things and the institutional imperative of remembering what one has done and what one has been in a context in which the world is changing constantly, and you may need to remember those things at some point, even if you don't think you might need them right now. So that's a second narrative. And the third narrative actually has to do with the piece of the book where we got the chance to tell kind of this unclassified version of the story of the maritime strategy. And that's also about institutional change. It's about, or lack of change. It's about the challenge of institutions that kind of get stuck in these path dependencies of getting locked into a particular vision of how they think the world is or the adversary is, and how difficult that can be to change, but also that it is possible to change. And the story of how the big bureaucracy of the Navy responded to new insights, both from Intel and from open source and open source analysis, stolen Intel and open source Intel, to come up with a radically new way of approaching the missions that they faced and would face in World War III at sea. Was first of all, was really fun to tell. But that's another narrative that was also part of the Admiral's Advantage. And this, so these subtexts of the challenges of making information and insight fit with strategy and drive strategy and change, have strategy change when the information changes, right? So there are a lot of intertwined bits. And in some sense, I feel that Admiral's Advantage was all these three things at the same time. Although, of course, first and foremost, it's just history of where our great Opintel institutions have been and were for a long time. But it was damn good fun to be part of the project. I'm really delighted to catch up back again with the topic at this point, all these years removed. So thanks for asking me to show up here. Thanks.
This is for Bryan Lees. Bryan, you quote Rear Admiral Tom Brooks, and you say, lest you imagine Rear Admiral Tom Brooks offered that there was some master plan for Opintel. There was, and then what drove the shipboard Opintel evolution? What were the drivers, Bryan? Can you drill down into that a little bit?
Well, I think the drivers, that's a great question. I was a bit taken back when Admiral Brooks told me there was nothing. Like there was no doctrine. He said there might have been some SOPs that were at the ship level, stuff like that. But what I found was that the drivers were the the understanding by the intelligence officer of who their boss was and what their boss needed. And so this was really a servant ethos that was driving them to find whatever ways, like Kimo said, we were very pragmatic about how we get things done to make sure the boss had the best information to make the best decision. When I talked to Nels Litzinger and them about who was their boss, because your squadron AI is going to go to the IOIC and be assigned there. So is he serving the admiral, the ship CO, or his CO? And Nels said, I knew who my boss was. It was always my squadron CO. But I knew that in the bigger scheme of things, that to make the mission occur, I had to support, I had to cooperate and draw together all of the things that were necessary to make sure that the entire strike group understood the enemy, understood where and what they were doing, and understood how to defeat them whenever they needed to. So the answer is really the driver is that the moral compass and the service ethos of the intelligence officer themselves.
Thanks, Bryan. Jim, do you want to add anything to that before I follow up?
No, I think Bryan hit it spot on.
Okay, thanks. The reason I asked that question is because I'm thinking about the necessary continuing reinvention of these kinds of things and how organizations, in this case, the U.S. Navy and the intelligence community within it, are going to modify and formulate and specify their capabilities in the context of great power competition, which, after all, is sort of new on the block after being off the screen for a long time. And this is anything but a trivial challenge. And that's why I asked the question. And I also think that this kind of organizational integrity that permits this reinvention and this deep introspection is important not just for Navy intelligence, but it seems to me that it's important for the rest of the Navy, and for that matter, for those of us in our private lives. So I really appreciate the insights, and I think those insights really have legs. Unless somebody has a better idea, I'm going to tell you what Robbie Harris has asked now twice in the chat. What happened to Intel in conjunction with the Tonkin Gulf in 1964? Are either of you in a position to address that question? Robbie's a real gent, but he does ask hard questions.
So I did look at that event, right? It was something that was important. I do mention it in the book, but only in as much as to create the understanding of why we were there, right? We had been in that area operating for some time, right? There was the Laos, Pathos Laos uprising and the communist problem there. In fact, I start that section with the RF the RF-8s getting shot at while they're trying to collect imagery over the plain of jars, and the first pilot we lose, who gets captured, happens on that mission. That's long before we get involved in Vietnam, Indochina properly, and long before the Gulf of Tonkin incident. There's a lot of ambiguity that occurs at sea. At this time, that you only know as much as your sensor on the ship can tell you. We did not have this network of national intelligence systems that could give us a broader understanding of the operating environment. And so at night and in amongst scattered radar reflections and other things, there was confusion. Now, there is some debate about how those things were reported and what the analysis was. But again, you have to remember it was a very tense situation at a very tense time. So was the intelligence bad? I don't know. I mean, there's only operational success and intelligence failure. So from that perspective, I guess it was. But I mean, I really just don't think we'll ever know the real amount of details there. There's also a lot of speculation and revisionist stuff that explains it away, but I don't think we'll ever really know. It was a complex environment, and we lacked the systems and tools to really be able to understand it. That's about all I can really say about it. Kimo?
I do not have any definitive knowledge. There's both sides. There's reports that there was, things were falsely reported on purpose to generate the response from the Maddox. And so I'll just say that we won't know, like you said. And the fact is that we're here where we are. There's controversy that surrounds 7 December 1941. There's controversy that surrounds 9/11. There's going to be these controversies. We're probably never going to get away from that. The question is, how do you deal with it once you're in the fight? And that's the issue, I think, that your book talks about and we're about, which is we're in the fight. What do we do? And strategically, let's not get in the fight. That's preferable. But if we get in it, how do we perform? And that's the real issue.
Thank you both. Those are, I think, profound answers to Robbie's questions. Lydia Miller, over to you, please.
Yes, thank you so much, Paul. Good afternoon, gentlemen. Ensign Lydia Miller. I'm very fascinated about the Cold War topic, both from me being born in Ukraine, so I speak fluent Russian. So I've been exposed to all the Cold War things, but from opposite perspective, and from just me commissioning and entering the fleet. What I've noticed is that a lot of people are just not educated on great power competition, and there's just a lack of information being operationalized, which is what I feel like what you really got to is that the difference between intelligence and information is that if you operationalize it, then it actually becomes useful. So my question to you is like, how can we get the fleet more educated on the matter so then we could have the information flowing a little bit more from the bottom up rather than from the top bottom? Thank you so much.
For me personally, my passion is been on the PRC and the PLA Navy. So, what do? You do what you can do. You reach out and you become one of the slides I didn't show and was this mindset of deeply penetrating the enemy. So if you are in your position where you're at in the fleet coming into the Navy and you're assigned a missionary and you think it's important, you don't think there's attention to it, then become the expert on it. Know it inside and outside, know every aspect of it, and know the enemy better than they know themselves, and then start doing your job, writing your reports, putting out your spot reps, wherever you're at in that process, and then talk to people about it, talk to your bosses, get the word out, and warn. Warning is warning. So if people aren't paying attention, then that's your job, is to warn them and let them know where the adversary is, not just today, but where they're going to be in the future. And if you don't see any response from that, I think this is the corollary that probably Admiral Showers never really had, because in his day, it was presumed that if you warned your boss that was a senior officer about something, that there would be action. And I think today, with the multitude of communications and all the challenges, the global operations and everything, it's hard to get your voice heard. And so, we're living in a system today where we still have, in the Pentagon, we still have this mindset that each service gets their fair share of the pie when it comes to the total obligation authority, the amount of resources. But this is after 40 years of gutting the Navy while we were mired in land warfare in the CENTCOM AOR. We should be able to inform our Chief of Naval Operations of the details of the threat from the Chinese Navy and their Air Force and their shore-based strategic rocket force, what that means for sea control and sea supremacy in a fight in the Western Pacific. And we should be arguing that, hey, it's not good to say everybody gets an equal share of the TOA. The Navy now needs the biggest share, and we shouldn't be apologetic for that. So somewhere somebody is not telling the CNO and, saying, hey, this is important, and here's the real threat and what it really means. Now, I know the CNO, he was chief of staff at SubPac when I was at Pac Fleet. So I know Daryl, and he knows the threat. But the reality is we haven't got to a position where, at least from the naval perspective, we're informing that five-sided wind tunnel about the requirements for the Navy and why we need to have more of it. So I would just say wherever you're at in starting your career, you got to do that. If you see the threat, you see the problem, and nobody's responding, then go after it like a dog on a bone.
Well, I would just add to those great words, that communication skill that I think is most important is writing. I didn't recognize it then, but now that I've been teaching for 10 years, being able to communicate with good white paper, good information paper, especially at a classified level, is the way you get your voice heard to the senior levels, right? If that paper is written well and credible, it'll get forwarded up. It'll get attached to something else on the way up. And yes, I would say get your unclassified things published as well. And don't be afraid of the debate that they may bring. I published a couple articles thanks to Bill Hamlet and Bill Frey at Proceedings, and I drew some heat for those, but it was good debate. It was good things that needed to come out. So I think Kimo's words are very sound and wise.
Thanks, Bryan. And Jim and Lydia, thank you for the question. It strikes me that perhaps as a follow-on conversation, I wonder if the naval intelligence enterprise isn't the logical channel for communicating to the fleet on sort of current events that would get at the issue that Lydia is talking about. But let's move on from that. Bill Hamlet, you're next.
To Lydia's point, and I'm happy to report that here at the Naval Institute, the Naval Academy and O&I decided to use our facility to provide classified threat briefings. First time they've ever done it, classified threat briefings to the first class midshipmen here at the Academy this week. So we had about a third of the class of 2026 in our auditorium each day for the last 3 days, providing primarily focused on, from what I understand, the PLA Navy, but also a bit of a broader global perspective. So I'm happy that we could be part of that. Not that I was part of the briefings, but that our facility was used for that. And I think that gets to Lydia's point that junior officers have to be aware from the get-go of what they're facing out there in the world, particularly in the Western Pacific, with our peer adversary. I just wanted to bring up and Bryan, congrats on the book. That's a huge accomplishment. I look forward to reading it. I was thinking as you and Jim both talked, one of the most striking things in my recollection of being an intelligence officer, my first deployment was on the USS Theodore Roosevelt, 1988-89 timeframe, when she was the newest aircraft carrier in the fleet. And I remember going out to sea and going on a 6-month med deployment. We left in early '89, and we left with all the imagery that we would have of all the potential target sets in places like Syria, Lebanon, the Southwest TVD of the Soviet Union, and the Libya was another one, right? It was all on these big flat paper copies. And so when we left, it was a month old. By the time we were 4 months into the deployment, it was 4 or 5 months old. And if you were a diligent young intelligence officer, and I was semi-diligent as an ensign, you could read all the information that came to the carrier every single day. You could read all the message traffic, you could read all the intel traffic. You'd stop by subplot a couple times a day. You'd flip through the read book and you'd be caught up. By the time I went back to sea again in the early to mid 90s, because communications technology had come so far, you couldn't possibly keep up with all the information that flowed to the carrier. And so that drove some behavioral changes. You could no longer just be a squadron AI who was kind of answering to your squadron CO and your pilots in your squadron. You really had to be a team, because it was only a team that could digest as a whole all that information and make sense of it each day. And I think Jim's effort to lead the out in the Western Pacific, and then the Seventh Fleet, and then the Pac Fleet Intelligence Federation kind of took that point, on steroids, that only as a grand team working together could we make sense of what was happening, out there in the Western Pacific, as the Chinese built their force and exercised it and were more and more operational and active almost on a daily basis during his tenure out there. So, technology, to your point, Bryan, technology is kind of interesting to this story, but also it's key that as humans interact with new technology, that they think about, okay, how do we make the best of this? How do we sort of reorganize ourselves on the fly, so that we can ingest it and make sense of it and make sense of what the threat's doing for our bosses.
Thanks, Bill. That was really terrific. It dipping my toe into Chat GPT, and I'm convinced that issues like that, where it's bandwidth issues, that AI is going to be perhaps some resolution of the problem. But we can come back to that another time. Norman Friedman.
If you go back to the Tonkin Gulf question, which I think has a lot of depth to it, I think you'll find out that at that time, naval intelligence, operational or otherwise, didn't have access to SI type information. And in fact, some of what NSA was doing during the Tonkin Gulf period led eventually to being able to integrate it. If you think about what was happening in Vietnam a few years later, that was revolutionary, that we were using SI type information operationally, where previously there had been terror of letting it be used anytime except the big war, because that would give away sources and methods. And to my mind, that's the beginning of having effective naval operational intelligence in the Cold War. Now, all of what's been discussed comes mostly after that. So you don't realize how revolutionary that was, but it was. I didn't work on that, but I knew someone who had. So, and that was the predecessor of Iron Horse, which is really a second generation. The idea that if we lump together everything we've got, we can make it work tactically. Boy, was that revolutionary. And I think that turns out to be the beginning of a lot of these things. The other thing is that there's a way in which intelligence information becomes a kind of sensor. And I think that that's something that's a Cold War development and terribly important right now. I don't know how you define it. I've tried for many years, but in some way, intelligence information now becomes partly sensing information, which you couldn't do without the intelligence content. It may be that normal sensor information doesn't require serious interpretation, although it really does. And intelligence information sure as hell does. But it's a combination that's very interesting organizationally. Otherwise, obviously, I applaud what's been written, particularly this last book, which is terrific. Thank you.
Norman, that's a characteristically terrific intervention. Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And I don't know about anybody else, but I learned a lot from the couple of minutes you were talking. We're going to wrap up now, but before we do, I want to get on the record a chat question that was provided by Jeff Klein from the Naval Postgraduate School. We won't necessarily discuss this, at least not while we're recording. But here's Jeff's intervention. Low priority question: how do the skills of an historian align with an intelligence officer? Don't both professions require searching for clues, finding incomplete data, and then composing a meaningful story? I would not expect any less from the great Jeff Klein. Thank you very much, Jeff. That was really terrific. ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap up the recording now here in just a moment. I want to thank our guests, Bryan Lees and Jim Fanell, Dave Rosenberg and Jeff Ford, and those of you who have asked questions and raised your hands, and those of you who have joined us in real time. The next First Wednesday CPAR workshop will be on March 4th at 4 o'clock Washington time. That's Washington, D.C. time. We're busy working out the schedule for that session. Upcoming guests will include Admiral Jamie Fogo, and the inimitable Dr. Norman Friedman, who will discuss his new Naval Institute press book, Cold War Anti-Submarine Warfare. We look forward to seeing you next month, and we'll forward the link to the YouTube recording of this Sea Power workshop as soon as it has been posted by the U.S. Naval Institute.